Please be seated. Young people are dismissed for junior church. It's not every day, decades ago, that you can remember where you were when something happened. Often it's a tragedy. Like I remember watching the events in Tiananmen Square live on TV. I remember hearing about the Challenger explosion in my 6th grade classroom. And I remember sitting in front of the TV on April 21st, 1986, for The Mystery of Al Capone's Vaults, a syndicated television program, 2 hours live. Now, looking back on it, I realized they had about 5 minutes worth of TV, but they stretched it out for 2 hours, during which Geraldo Rivera was doing all sorts of nonsense and talking about things. I think he fired a Tommy gun because he had discovered that in the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, a building once owned by Al Capone, that there was a room that had been sealed since that day. And so there was all this hype. What's in there? Jewels, money, weapons, all sorts of amazing things must be in Al Capone's vault. Some of you aren't old enough to remember this. The rest of you are shaking your heads and giggling because you remember. 30 million people in the United States watched the highest rated syndicated special in history. And when they opened the room, it was empty. There was nothing in there but a little bit of rubbish. It was all hype and no substance. The amazing thing is that wasn't the end of Geraldo Rivera's career. He actually parlayed that massive flop into a new career because, frankly, 30 million people watched, and that meant a lot of advertising dollars. Consider that all show and no substance imagery, because it's a very good analogy for what we're talking about this morning in Mark chapter 11. I told you last time that we are skipping verses 12 and 14, and we're going to come back to them. You see from our text this morning, we've got the bookends, 12 to 14 and 19 to 23. Last week we looked at what was in the middle. Now let's see what Mark frames it with. So let's start with the text. It says, "The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry." So we are on our way into Jerusalem. A few hours from this moment that Mark is telling us about, Jesus will be in the temple courts, flipping tables, driving animals and people out of the court of the Gentiles. That is the part in the middle. We're told that Jesus was hungry. I can't help but hearing when someone asks about being hungry, I can't help but picture those Snicker commercials with Betty White and Abe Kubota and Aretha Franklin and all these people that are having a bad day because they're hungry and they need a Snickers. They didn't have Snickers in the first century. Jesus is out of luck there. But evidently, he is still hungry after breakfast and he needs a snack. You're thinking, why are they telling us that Jesus wants a snack, right? Where is this going? It's going into an interesting place. Notice, seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. I would not walk up to a fig tree to try to eat some figs off the tree if I was hungry, because I don't like figs, but Jesus apparently liked figs. Mark is clearly pointing out to us here in the text what Jesus and his disciples already knew. It is too early in the season for edible figs to be on this tree. At this point, they're just the little one. They're not ready yet. This is like looking for a nice, juicy apple on an apple tree somewhere around here in June. There's a reason why we have Apple Fest in October and not or June or July, because if it was in June or July, we wouldn't have any apples, right? That would defeat the purpose. So really, there is no expectation of fruit. And I read several commentators who thought, well, there might have been early figs. Maybe this tree was ahead of the game a little bit, and of course with the different elevations and all of that. But I don't think Mark wants us to think that at all, because he says it was not the season for figs. Which leads to a question: why does Jesus go look to make sure? He knows it's not the season for figs. The disciples know it's not the season for figs. Why are we looking at this tree? That's the key question here. Because Jesus does go up to the tree, right? He purposefully goes up to the tree, knowing in advance that it's not going to have any edible figs on it yet. Why? The answer is in the text. What Jesus says next, which we'll look at in a minute, and then what happens in 19 to 23, which we'll get to eventually, but especially what Mark put in between, the clearing of the temple. That is the only thing that happened on this entire day in Jerusalem during the Holy Week that Mark tells us about, right? Jesus was there all day long, teaching, maybe performing miracles, having all sorts of interactions, and Mark says, I've got one thing to tell you about on that day: Jesus clearing the temple. Before it, a fig tree. After, a fig tree. Clearing the temple in the middle. That tells us why Jesus went to the tree. Because verses 15 to 18, what we looked at last week, the cleansing of the temple is a real life allegory of the symbolism of the fig tree. It is playing out in real life what Jesus is doing with this tree. Mark arranges his material to highlight that connection so you won't miss it. The disciples themselves may have not noticed at the time, but Mark, when he is writing his gospel, says these things are connected. So as such, first century Judaism revolving around the temple in Jerusalem, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, the high priests, the whole system is represented by this fig tree, which unfortunately we're going to see has no fruit. It's got leaves, but no fruit. And it is about to be judged, just like this tree. Jesus will do one part of that a few hours later when he drives people out of the temple courts. The fullness of that prediction will come at the end of this generation when the temple itself is destroyed in 70 AD. Notice what Jesus says about the fig tree, which he knew would not have fruit, but he checked anyway. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," and his disciples heard him say it. There are a number of skeptics and critics that don't get this passage. Bart Ehrman is one of them, and others that you may not have heard of, where they say, what is Jesus doing? Why is he cursing a tree? That's so random, it's so foolish, it doesn't make any sense. He should have known the tree wouldn't have fruit. This doesn't fit. It makes all the sense in the world when you look at it from what Mark is trying to tell us. Despite the current circumstances which make fruit impossible, Jesus still pronounces judgment on the tree. And you might be saying, that's not fair. It's not. Who is Jesus? He's the Son of God, creator of heavens and earth. If he wants to curse a tree out of season, that's his right. Because this is a teaching moment. From a distance, one might have thought that leaves meant fruit, right? You look at the tree, it's full of leaves, there's got to be fruit. But when you go up and you look closer, you see that hope is in vain. So when Jesus arrives at the temple mere moments later, the temple will be full of noise and commotion. From a distance, it will appear to be thriving. Look at all the pilgrims. Look at all the things that are happening here, all of the sacrifices. Look at the Levites and the priests. They're busy. They're doing a lot. There's all sorts of things happening here that look familiar if you know the law of Moses and what the law requires. But on closer examination, the vast majority of the effort that is happening there is in vain because there is no fruit. Now, there must have been some worshiping in Jerusalem this Passover that were sincere, that did approach God by faith, because God always has a remnant. He proved that to the prophet Elijah in his despair. There's always a remnant. But taken as a whole, this system centered around the temple worship in Jerusalem at this point in time is diseased. And it is an advanced, unfortunately terminal case. Things are not well at the temple, even though it looks busy. Let's keep going. Verse 19, we're picking it up after Jesus cleared the temple, verse that we looked at last week. Verse 19, when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. So as I said before, the only thing Mark tells us between these two interactions with a fig tree that Jesus is going to treat symbolically is the cleansing of the temple. As a reader of the Word of God, it's often beneficial to ask yourself the question, what is the author trying to get me to see here? What does he want me to understand? When we interpret the Bible, authorial intent is an important piece of the puzzle. It's actually something I talked about extensively in my class last Thursday over in Edville about the Bible, about the author. What the author thought and meant and intended is very important. It helps us understand what the audience originally reading it 2,000, 2,500 years ago, depending on what we're looking at in the Bible, what would they have thought about it? That's foundational. It helps us build our application here and now, because that's what we ultimately need to find out, right? What does this text mean here and now to us? We start by saying, what did it mean to them, and what did the author want them to see? Mark wants us to connect the fig tree to the temple. Fig tree, temple, fig tree. It's quite obvious. What happened to the fig tree is a prediction about what's going to happen to the temple. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. I picked two pictures of fig trees in the Middle East today. Imagine seeing the one on the left and then coming back the next day and seeing the one on the right. That is not natural. That's not what happens to a tree in one day. 24 hours later, this tree is dead. From full of leaves to dead in one day. That's not a coincidence. Jesus intends to use the demise of this tree to teach an important lesson to his disciples. And because it is recorded in Scripture, that lesson is for us as well. So let's keep going and figure it out. 21, Peter remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. You got to love Peter. Peter is always ready to answer the question first or to offer an opinion, and he says, wow, the tree is dead. He makes the connection between the curse and the tree. If you go back in the Old Testament, you'll see time and time again that the faithfulness of Israel, the ability of the people to keep the covenant, to live righteously by faith, to love their neighbor, etc., that is continually compared to fruit, being fruitful. And of course, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament uses the same analogy for Christians, that our fruit is what we need to produce. And Jesus himself in the Gospels talks about fruit many times. But it's also interesting to note that in the Old Testament, the prophets Joel, Amos, Micah, Zechariah, and Ezekiel, so not just once, mention that Israel in the Messianic age, in the glorious age to come, will bear figs. They specifically call the fruit that Israel will bear a fig, which of course is a common tree in the area. So with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, we just read that a few weeks ago, right? That was just 2 days ago. That was Sunday, this is Tuesday morning. They are seeing the tree withered to the root. Expectations in Jerusalem amongst the disciples and all sorts of people, because Jesus is here, are sky high. They believe that the golden age, the Messianic age, the prophesied age is about to happen. It's right around the corner. And yet this withered, figless, or fruitless fig tree, figless fruit tree, whatever, is a hard lesson for them. This generation of Israel is not producing sufficient fruit. The Messianic age is not around the corner. Judgment is. The hand of God will be upon them in judgment, not a Messianic glory age. Because this is not a fruitful generation like they think they are. So yeah, this is cold water poured on their heads after the Sunday's triumph. Which makes these next words fascinating to me. Have faith in God, Jesus answered. Out of context, you might just assume he means have faith in God because God can do this to a tree, right? There's a bigger picture here. I don't think the disciples understood this lesson right away. I think they just thought about the fig tree. But Mark saw it when he wrote it down. Jesus repeatedly warns in the Gospels that true faith produces fruit. True faith affects our lives. It transforms us. It leads us to living righteously in this life. Jesus tells people to have faith in God in a variety of ways in the Gospels. Before this, after this, when he says that, have faith in God is something Jesus says. Here, the call for faith follows after the disappointment of shattered expectations. The people may still have high expectations, but they are going to be shattered, right? It is easier seemingly to have faith in God when tomorrow is expected to be better than today, isn't it? When you expect that things are going to get better, faith is pretty easy. When things are looking up, when hope is well placed, it's harder to have faith when tomorrow is uncertain, or even when tomorrow's forecast is dismal, when failure and loss are familiar to us. And yet our need of faith remains the same, rain or shine, in an absolute sense. We always need faith. It is our perception, our emotional response that grows where we think we need it more in the deep, dark valley, and we think we don't need it when the sun is shining. Because when we're in that darkness, we cry out, Father, I'm scared. But whatever is happening, we need to have faith. And they certainly needed to have faith in this moment. Truly, I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself in the sea, and doesn't doubt in their heart, but believes in that what they say will happen, it'll be done for them. 3 days from Jesus telling his disciples, have faith in God. He will be betrayed, tried, beaten, and crucified. It'll be the darkest moment in human history. And Jesus just told them, have faith. At that time, hope will seem foolish between Friday and Sunday. Despair like a justifiable emotion. And yet, unspeakable joy and lasting salvation are only 3 days away when Jesus breathes his last. The temple is doomed. God's judgment rests upon it and the whole system in Jerusalem because it is fruitless. But God already has in place a better plan to draw men to himself, to draw people to himself from all over the world. And he will make from them a family of adopted children from every tribe and nation and family. Faith will accomplish this. Jesus' faith in the Father, Jesus' faith in the plan that he laid forth with the Father, and Jesus' faith in the victory that awaits beyond the grave. Faith will prevail. Faith in God can do all of this. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't share a pop culture reference with you. Luke Skywalker in Empire Strikes Back is able to handle lifting rocks with the Force, right? He can balance on one hand, lift some stuff up. But when Yoda says, lift your X-Wing out of the swamp, he tries and then sits down and says, it's too big, I can't do it. And then, of course, John Williams' score raises up, and Yoda shows him that size is only a limitation in his mind. For the Force doesn't care how big it is. You know what? George Lucas stole that from Jesus. Jesus said that 2,000 years earlier, just wasn't an X-Wing in a swamp, because he said, with faith, moving a molehill and a mountain is exactly the same thing. For faith, size matters not. Why? Because the faith isn't in you. The faith isn't in me. The faith is in God. And so the question is not, can I move a mountain? But can God move a mountain? And the answer is, I would think so. God put that mountain there in the first place. If he had the power to put it there, I'm sure he has the power to move it if he needs to. The power of faith utilized by the people of God to do the will of God is greater than we dream or imagine. The limitations are on our end, not God's. So without fruit, without faith and hope and love, none of the trappings of religion make a difference. If the temple wasn't capable of overcoming the failures of the people who gathered there, then no building, no organization, no denomination, no movement will be able to overcome fruitlessness. We labor in vain when we labor apart from the word, from God's will, when we ignore what he has revealed to us in his word. But on the flip side, when God's people do walk by faith, when they live in love, when they seek righteousness, mountains in our path had better prepare themselves to get out of the way. 3 words of application from this text for us before we begin communion. Number 1, all leaves and no fruit is unacceptable to God. That's not going to cut it. You got to have fruit. Secondly, we are called to have faith, no matter what tomorrow holds. And then thirdly, faith is far more powerful than you or I ever realize.